we are planning a new survey with questionnaires after the tests are done. So right away, immediately, a separate scoring of intelligibility and comprehensibility to make sure that the undergrad's understanding of the test taker's performance matches the rater's score. So of course that it would be anonymous, and that would not interfere with the score, but it will interfere with the rating and training of these raters, so we can make the test a better test.
So we have just a little bit of time left, so is there anything else that you want to add before we open it up for discussion? Oh, Youngsoon, if you could talk about that.
Maybe Bahiyyih can start with who has
The definition of native speaker.
Who will take the test?
Right, so all non-native speakers have to take the test, but the thing is, what is the definition of non-native speakers? So obviously, if you were born here, you don't have to take the test. If you were an American citizen, you don't have to take the test. And there are other exceptions as well. So for example, if you speak English at home with your family, with your parents, you could be excused. You could get a letter of exemption. If you take your undergrad studies here, or high school here, like the earlier the better, because we believe that earlier people would have a chance to improve their oral skills or their English proficiency better than older adults. So they could also be excused. Anybody else is excused?
Maybe I can just point out that it has been an evolving refinement of the definition of native speaker. So when Speak was in place here, I think the definition of native speaker was limited to citizenship, which is problematic for many reasons. And so, or at one time it was. No, maybe not. I think you were exempt if you had citizenship, though, is one of the issues. And it has evolved since then. Some definitions included if you were a speaker of a world English, which was, Canadian English, Australian English, and then there was lots of contestation for other nations that have English as a dominant language, but it is accented or marked in such a way that it is quote-unquote unintelligible or difficult to understand. One of the biggest, one of the populations with the most difficulty in accepting these definitions of native speakers, perhaps those from different regions of India, because India, individuals from, graduate students from India have been learning English as native speakers their whole lives. And so that was a point of contention for them, and some other groups also.
Yeah, and one other thing I really wanted to note is the definition of a native speaker. The definition of a native speaker is important to determine who needs to be tested, but more importantly, we need that kind of definition when we design a test, because we need a norm against which we test second language learners. But the problem is, who are the native speakers? How can you define the native speakers for whom the second language learners are expected to emulate? I think that's an open question.
Thank you very much to the panel.
I just wanted to tell what the USC levels at the moment are only where English is the official language, and we are in the process of taking out if you have a BA from a US institution. So it's basically those 3-4 countries where English is acknowledged as the official language at the moment.
Thank you. So just a couple things thematically that have come up is, first of all, like Professor Lindemann talked about, encouraging Arizona to hire more linguists. The whole notion that we need to have a real deep understanding of how language and discourse work and to be trained in that in order to assess individuals best. And also, in terms of how we assess and whom we assess, we talked a lot about how this is the exam itself is part of a broader system that involves a number of different stakeholders. So it goes from rater training to questioner hiring to the exam itself to counseling after the exam to courses that individuals can take after taking the exam, individuals in charge of the exam communicating with departments. So it's an ongoing process, that it isn't simply that you are all of a sudden monitored one day and you have no warning about that, and that you don't know what to do. So it's more a broader system of communication. And the one last thing I think is important, because I'm sure as we're having all of these discussions about these really important issues, is to think about a meta assessment, to constantly think about assessing our assessment practices and how to really think critically about ongoing new research that's being done, about perceivers' roles, and about how do we define a native speaker in the globalized world, to really think how can our policies be responsive to this new research, and to really think critically about, okay, we had a model 7 years ago of how we wanted to test students. Does it match the realities that we know today? So I think being responsive to current research, I think, is really, really key, and we try to do that here at UCLA. So if we can just open it up for questions.
Questions for?
Thank you very much. I've done quite a lot of work in assessment. I know how unbelievably complicated and complex it is. I do have a question that I've been struggling with, which is kind of subtle in my own mind, and that is that although we understand that intelligibility obviously is a crucial issue in oral proficiency, is there a concept in testing around how hard the perceiver has to work to understand? Don't quite know how to articulate this, but if you're speaking to somebody who has the same dialect as you do, you don't have to work terribly hard to understand the person. You can speak to somebody else who is perhaps even a native speaker, but perhaps a different dialect, but you may be required to work a little harder, even though it's still intelligible, it's completely intelligible, but it requires a little more effort on your part. And it's hard to quantify that. But I'm just wondering whether that somehow feeds into, this whole field in some ways. I'm thinking also of Stephanie's work, that question of the perceiver's role. Does it have something to do with just the fact that you may need to work a little harder, even though somebody is intelligible? Anyway, I'll just throw it out as a question.